Mama Cass did not choke on a sandwich. That is a lie. It has been repeated for 52 years. It was in the newspapers the week she died. It is still on the internet today. It is one of the most persistent myths in the history of popular music, and it is completely, demonstrably, medically false. Cass Elliot died on July 29, 1974, in a flat at 9 Curzon Place in Mayfair, London. She was 32 years old. She had just completed 2 sold-out weeks at the London Palladium, the greatest performances of her solo career. The reviews had been extraordinary. She was happy. She called her mother after the final show and told her it had been the best night of her life. She went back to the flat, which belonged to the singer-songwriter Harry Nilsson, who had lent it to her for the London run, and she went to sleep. She did not wake up. When she was found the next morning, there was a half-eaten ham sandwich on the bedside table. A doctor who arrived at the scene speculated before any autopsy had been performed that she may have choked on the sandwich. A journalist heard this. The headline wrote itself. The official coroner's inquest, conducted by Dr. Keith Simpson, one of the most respected forensic pathologists in Britain, found no food in her airway. None. The cause of death was heart failure, brought on by a condition called fatty myocardial degeneration. Cass Elliot's heart had given out in her sleep. She had not choked. She had not been eating. The sandwich was untouched except for a single bite taken hours earlier. The coroner's report was published. It was clear, it was unambiguous, and nobody cared. The sandwich story was already around the world. Why? Because a fat woman dying from choking on food is a punchline. A fat woman dying of heart failure at 32 is a tragedy, and the world preferred the punchline. Cass Elliot was born Ellen Naomi Cohen in Baltimore, Maryland in 1941. She grew up in a Jewish family in Alexandria, Virginia. She was big from childhood, tall, broad, the kind of body that the 1950s had no cultural space for. She was also, from childhood, the funniest person in every room and the best singer in every school choir. She wanted to be on Broadway. She moved to New York as a teenager and started performing in folk clubs and small theatrical productions. She was talented, charismatic, and impossible to ignore. But the industry kept telling her the same thing. You have the voice, but you don't have the look. In the early 1960s, the look meant thin. Cass was not thin. She would never be thin, and she refused to pretend she was ashamed of it. She found her way into the Greenwich Village folk scene, the same scene that produced Bob Dylan, Karen Dalton, Fred Neil. She sang in a group called the Big Three, then in the Mugwumps with Denny Doherty and Zal Yanofsky. She was always the one with the biggest voice and the biggest personality. She was also the one who kept getting passed over when record labels came looking. In 1965, she met John and Michelle Phillips. They were forming a vocal group. John Phillips was a tall, handsome, arrogant songwriter who heard harmonies the way other people hear weather, instinctively, structurally, in 4 parts at once. He had already recruited Denny Doherty. He needed a 4th voice. Cass wanted in. John Phillips said no. He said her voice was too big. He said she would overpower the blend. The man who was building one of the greatest vocal groups in history told the woman with the greatest voice he had ever heard that she was too much. Cass Elliot's entire career was built on being told she was too much, too big, too loud, too present, and showing up anyway. What happened next was the proof. The story of how Cass joined the Mamas and the Papas has multiple versions. The one Cass told most often, and the one the band never fully denied, is that she was hit on the head by a falling pipe at a construction site, and her vocal range suddenly expanded by 3 notes. This is almost certainly not true. What is true is that John Phillips eventually heard her sing in a way that fit the blend. and he relented. Cass was in. California Dreamin' was released in December 1965. It reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. It is now considered one of the defining songs of the 1960s, the sound of a generation dreaming itself westward. The harmonies are unlike anything else in pop music. 4 voices weaving around each other in a way that sounds both effortless and architecturally precise. Cass's voice, warm, round, enormous, is the anchor. Without it, the harmonies float. With it, they land. Monday Monday followed in 1966, number 1 for 3 weeks. Then Words of Love, then Dedicated to the One I Love. The Mamas and the Papas became one of the biggest groups in America. They played the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, the festival that introduced Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Otis Redding to mainstream America. John Phillips co-organized it. Cass stood on the side of the stage in a flowing caftan and watched Hendrix set his guitar on fire. She was 25 years old. The group lasted 3 years. By 1968, the personal relationships had fractured. John and Michelle were divorcing. Denny and Cass had been lovers and were no longer, and the harmonies that required 4 people to trust each other completely could not survive 4 people who no longer did. The Mamas and the Papas disbanded in 1968. Cass Elliot was 27. She had been a member of one of the biggest groups in American pop history for 3 years. Now she was on her own. Cass Elliott's solo career is the part of her story that the sandwich myth erased. People remember her as a member of the Mamas and the Papas. They do not remember that she spent the last 6 years of her life building something of her own, and that she was succeeding. Dream a Little Dream of Me, released in 1968 as a Mamas and Papas track, but credited featuring Mama Cass, became her signature song. It is a 1931 standard that Cass turned into something entirely different. A lullaby sung by a woman with a voice too big for lullabies, which is exactly what makes it work. The gentleness is earned. The softness comes from someone who has to choose to be soft. That is why people cry when they hear it. She hosted television specials. She had her own variety show on ABC. She was a regular on every major talk show in America. She was warm, funny, self-deprecating, and completely herself on camera, in a way that almost no performer of her era managed. She made being big look like a choice rather than a failure. And in the 1960s and 70s, that was a radical act. She struggled financially. The Mamas and the Papas' earnings had been mismanaged, and Cass came out of the group with far less money than the public assumed. She owed the IRS. She worked constantly, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She was a single mother. Her daughter Owen was born in 1967. Every gig, every TV appearance, every Las Vegas residency was partly about keeping the lights on. By 1974, she had rebuilt. She was booked for 2 weeks at the London Palladium, the most prestigious venue in British entertainment. This was her chance to prove that Mama Cass was not a novelty act from a disbanded 60s group. This was her chance to prove she was a serious solo artist. She was 32 years old. The London Palladium shows were a triumph. 2 sold-out weeks, standing ovations every night. The British press, which had always been kinder to Cass than the American press, gave her the best reviews of her career. One critic wrote that she had finally stepped out of the shadow of the group and revealed herself as one of the great voices of her generation. On the final night, July 28, 1974, she took her bow to a full house and walked off stage into the wings. She called her mother in Baltimore. She said, "I've finally made it." She called her manager. She said the same thing. She was exhausted and elated, and for the first time in years, sure of what came next. She went back to Harry Nilsson's flat at 9 Curzon Place. Nilsson had lent her the flat for the Palladium run. It was a comfortable Mayfair apartment on the 4th floor. She went to bed. She did not wake up. She was found the next morning by her assistant. She was lying in bed. There was a half-eaten ham sandwich on the bedside table. A doctor was called. Before any forensic examination had been conducted, the doctor noted the sandwich and speculated to someone in the room, possibly a journalist, possibly a press liaison, that she may have choked on it. By the afternoon, the sandwich was in every newspaper in London. By the evening, it was in every newspaper in America. The official autopsy had not been conducted yet. Nobody had examined her airway. Nobody had tested for food obstruction. But a doctor saw a fat woman dead in a bed with a sandwich beside her, and the story told itself. 52 years later, it is still being told. The official coroner's report, conducted by Dr. Keith Simpson, was published weeks later. The findings were unambiguous. There was no food in Cass Elliott's airway. She had not choked. The cause of death was heart failure, fatty myocardial degeneration. Her heart had been enlarged and weakened, likely by years of crash dieting. Cass had spent her adult life trying to lose weight, not for herself, but because the industry told her she had to. The dieting had damaged her heart. The heart had failed in her sleep. The coroner's report was clear. The newspapers did not run corrections. The sandwich story stayed. It stayed because it was a better story. Not better in the sense of true, but better in the sense of easy. A fat woman choking on a sandwich is a joke that writes itself. A 32-year-old mother dying of heart failure caused by an industry that told her she needed to be thinner is not funny. It is an indictment. And indictments do not sell newspapers. Cass Elliott's daughter, Owen Elliot-Kugell, has spent decades trying to correct the record. In interviews, in her memoir, in public appearances, she has said the same thing over and over. My mother did not choke on a sandwich. She died of heart failure. Please stop repeating the lie. The lie continues. 4 years after Cass died in that flat, Keith Moon, the drummer of The Who, died in the same flat, same address, 9 Curzon Place, same bedroom. Harry Nilsson, who owned the flat, sold it afterwards. He said he could not keep it. 2 musicians had died in the same room. Nobody made a joke about Keith Moon's death. Nobody reduced Keith Moon's entire life to the manner of his dying. The difference is that Keith Moon was thin. That is the truth that the sandwich story hides. Cass Elliott was one of the great voices of the 1960s. She co-created one of the most successful vocal groups in American history. She reinvented herself as a solo artist. She triumphed at the Palladium. And all of that was replaced within 24 hours of her death by a lie about food, because the world could not see a large woman without seeing food first. Cass Elliott died 52 years ago today. She was 32 years old. She was a mother. She was a singer. She was the anchor of the harmonies that defined California in the 1960s. She was the warm voice that turned "Dream a Little Dream of Me" into something that still makes people cry 60 years later. She did not choke on a sandwich. She died of heart failure in her sleep. After the greatest night of her career, the coroner proved it. The newspapers ignored it. The internet repeats it. And every time someone repeats it, they are choosing a punchline over a person. Her daughter Owen is still correcting the record. She should not have to. The record was corrected in 1974 by a coroner. The world chose not to listen. If you remember one thing from this video, let it be this. The next time someone says, "Didn't she choke on a sandwich?" say, "No, she didn't." Say her name. Say what she actually did. Say she sang California Dreamin' and Dream a Little Dream of Me and brought 2 sold-out weeks to the London Palladium. Say she was one of the great voices. Say the truth. Cass Elliot, the voice, not the lie. Subscribe. We do this every day.